oldest, most sustainable, most long-lived money systems ever devised were by the Sumerians and Egyptians, which lasted over 1,000 years each. The Sumerians, you could say 3,000, depending on how you calculate it. I got my data from Michael Hudson and Bernard Lietaer, so from their two books. And the Sumerians did not use money as we know it at all. It was just a system of debits and credits and pricing. And the Egyptians had they used grain money, as did the Sumerians, food money. And so they had grain banks where you could put in your deposit of grain, and you would get as a receipt this pottery that would have hieroglyphics on it, and that pottery did trade as if it were a form of money. But you didn't get interest for your deposit in this grain bank. In fact, you had to pay interest because grain tended to rot over time and because there was a storage fee. So it was only when money actually became a commodity, something valuable in itself, coins or paper banknotes, that it was able to be exploited. It was extractive. It became a tool of empire. It could be hoarded, manipulated, and lent at usurious interest rates. Silver and gold were, of all those commodities that the Sumerians, who then became the Babylonians, traded, silver and gold were the most practical because they didn't rot and because you could carry them around and trade them. But the problem with silver and gold is they also didn't grow. They weren't organic. So they didn't automatically create the interest to pay back the loan. And so the moneylender would lend out 10 and take back 11, lend out 11, take back 12 and a half. There was nowhere to get the extra interest except to take it from someone else, or somebody had to go into debt, lose their property, wind up in debtor's prison or slavery. It was actually the leading cause of slavery. And so this was not only not sustainable, it was actually the cause of the demise of empires. They crumbled under the weight of debt. During the Middle Ages, the Italian bankers figured out how to advance credit. So the Italian economy was booming, and they needed more money in the system. So the Italian bankers created credit on their books. But they were still technically dealing in gold, so it was really just an overdraft in the account of their customers. And so they were still dealing with limited gold, and it was sleight of hand. And so they would periodically get in trouble, and this was taken very seriously. For example, there was one example of a banker who was beheaded in front of his bank because he was unable to balance his books, which is probably a good model, but we don't follow it today, but maybe we should. But this would cause, the economy to collapse and much trouble. So to overcome that, public banks were set up in some city-states, like the Bank of Venice had a public bank, and the Bank of Florence, etc. There were also public banks at the local level. These were devised by the churches and the monasteries for the poor people. The poor had nothing to post as collateral. I mean, they didn't have land. And there was no way they could pay the 60% or so that the moneylenders were charging. And so these mons pietatis, as they were called, lent to the poor at very reasonable interest, or even no interest. And they evolved into the public banking systems that are still quite popular in Europe today. They're local, they're municipally owned, or they're community owned, or alternative type systems. In England, you had the moneylenders both competing with the tally system. In fact, the moneylenders were evicted in the 13th century because they were the people were rioting because they had fallen so far into debt to the moneylenders. And so for a period of 700 years, what they had as an alternative, the people's currency, was a tally system. It went from 1100 to 1834, and these were just sticks that were split in half with notches on them. So obviously they did not have value in themselves. They were just like the pottery of the Egyptians. They were basically receipts delivered by the government for goods and services given to the government either in the payment of taxes or as an advance against the payment of taxes. And so they circulated in the community as a form of money, and they could be accepted in the payment of taxes. So again, they were a unit of account rather than a store of value. However, in the 17th century, the moneylenders were let back in when Oliver Cromwell needed money to fund his revolution. He was obviously not the king, so he couldn't print money. So he borrowed from Dutch moneylenders, and they were allowed to set up the Bank of England, which would then lend their paper banknotes, supposedly backed by gold, but they did issue many more notes than they had gold. And these notes then became the national currency, and the king did not actually have to pay off the debt. He just had to pay the interest. So in effect, the government was renting the currency from these private moneylenders. That competed in the American colonies with the American colonial scrip, which again was a government-issued money paid for goods and services delivered to the government. So it's basically just an accounting system. It was just a system of receipts. It was started in 1691 when the governor of Massachusetts needed money to fund a war, and he didn't have gold and he didn't have anyone to borrow from, so he got the idea that he would just issue these little receipts to the soldiers for their service, and then of course the community recognized that value had been given and that value was due, and then those receipts circulated in the community. They were supposedly an advance against taxes, but because the governors of the colonies were not elected, they were not representatives of the people resisted paying taxes. So the governors were a lot better at printing the money than at collecting it back in taxes. So some of the colonies did manage to hyperinflate their currencies. But there was a particularly sustainable system, and that was in Pennsylvania and other middle colonies, but it was developed to its full potential by the Pennsylvanians. They actually had a bank, so it was a land bank. The government would issue paper scrip and lend it into the economy, so then it would come back as principal and interest. And because they were the government, they could pay a little extra in interest, and so there was enough money out there to cover principal and interest. So for example, you could issue 105 units of this currency, lend 100 at 5% interest, spend 5 on your budget, and then there would be 105 out there, which would all come back as principal and interest. You could lend the 100 again, spend the 5 again, it would all come back as principal and interest. You could do that over and over, and you didn't have to inflate your money supply in order to find the interest to cover principal and interest. And of course, the interest went back to the government, which was the people that funded the government. So it was a sustainable public system. But the merchants complained to the king about that they couldn't tell what they were dealing with in all these various colonial currencies competing with each other, and that some of them were hyperinflating. So the king forbade some of the colonies from issuing their own currency. And Benjamin Franklin then made the mistake of going to England and arguing the case for these currencies, and he said what a great thing it was. The colonies were prospering because they had their own currency, they had plenty of money to fund trade, and they were therefore becoming financially independent of England. And this, of course, did not please the Bank of England. In fact, they were quite alarmed, and they leaned on the king to forbade all the colonies to issue their own money, which they did. This created a depression because the money supply shrank, and so the colonists went back to issuing their own money, which was considered an act of rebellion. And the king sent in the redcoats, and we had the American Revolution. We won the revolution, but we lost the ability to print our own money for reasons I don't have time to go into. Abraham Lincoln restored the money issuing government-created money system of the colonists during the Civil War because he didn't want to. The bankers would lend to him only at usurious interest rates, 24 to 36%. And so to avoid that, he issued his own money, and that worked very well, won the war, and there was also an unusual period of expansion during that time. But he was assassinated, and that program was discontinued. continued, and by 1913 we had the Federal Reserve, which is purportedly public but largely private. I don't have time to go into that either. However, there were other ex-British colonies that did continue this credit-based currency system of government-issued credit. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and it did work brilliantly well. And in each case, it was the Bank of England that managed to nip this practice in the bud. In the Commonwealth Bank of Australia funded all sorts of seaways, roadways, fruit companies, all sorts of productive things, including their participation in World War I, just by issuing the credit of the nation. They didn't borrow from anyone, it wasn't backed by anything, they just issued credit in the same way that the American colonists had done. Worked brilliantly well. The only problem was that Governor Denison Miller, who was the head of the bank, made the mistake of going to the City of London and bragging about how independent they had become. And of course this alarmed the Bank of England. He died shortly thereafter of a heart attack, and the Bank of England set up a new system where it was the central banking system that we have today, where rather than the Treasury issuing the national currency, it would be issued by a central bank, which would lend the money to the government and to the bankers. And so, and the apex of this system would be the Bank of England. That word, the apex of the system, was actually used in a book of the 1930s that was describing this whole development. And the word was used again. Well, the man that was sent in to reign in Australia and New Zealand was Sir Otto Niemeyer, who was a governor of the Bank of England. And he later became the head of the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And the apex of the system also moved to the BIS. So the implication is it was the same system, it just moved over more discreetly into Switzerland. In 1966, Carroll Quigley wrote in Tragedy and Hope. He was a Georgetown University professor. He said he was groomed by the international bankers. He was an insider, and he was supposedly their librarian. And so he had all this 900 pages worth of data, which they wanted to keep quiet, but he thought that it should be published, so he put it in a book, which was quickly suppressed. But in it, he said, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans. So that's the system we have today, and that was set up intentionally by this whole banking parasitic elite, and that is what has happened to these more sustainable systems. It wasn't that they hyperinflated and died of their own accord. They were suppressed. They were intentionally suppressed. In New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was set up by Otto Niemeyer, but some social creditors got into power. C.H. Douglas had visited in Australia and New Zealand and in Canada and Japan and had quite an effect. So these were social creditors who set up a system where they used the bank to issue national credit, and they funded low-cost housing and various things. They got it because they could keep the interest, because they owned the bank. That cut the cost of projects in half, so it made projects that would otherwise be unsustainable quite sustainable. That worked until the Bank of England sent their emissary, who threatened to cut them off from trade with the Commonwealth if they did not cease these unsound practices, which they then did. But they had no control over Japan or Germany, which also did this system of just issuing the credit of the nation without borrowing from the international bankers. But they were stopped by war. Meanwhile, Canada was carrying on with the system. Their Bank of Canada was set up in 1935. So from 1939 to 1974, they issued credit to the government, interest-free because they owned the bank. And during that time, they funded all sorts of remarkable things, including pensions, their participation in World War II.